Welcome back to RotoQL University. This is our third course, MLB strategy, and today we'll be talking about advanced tournament strategy. This is Mike, and I'm here with Sahil.
How you doing, guys?
Great. Well, let's get into it. Starting with our overview for the lesson, with tournaments, the desired outcome is to create a lineup with high ceiling. And we're going to be looking at a few different categories in accomplishing this. Pitcher selection, hitter selection, and then lineup construction. Starting with pitcher selection. Now looking at some of the key elements for pitcher selection, research is obviously going to be an all-encompassing process, but you're going to want to take note of things like Vegas data, WOBA against for pitchers, strikeouts and opposing strikeouts, ballpark weather conditions, and of course things like pitch count and innings pitched. Sahil, some of the bigger takeaways from this slide. What are some of the stats that you find really useful for tournaments?
Yeah, so as we talk about creating a high ceiling, you want players that are able to score for DraftKings. You want to put players that can score 25 at least, or 30 plus, and then FanDuel probably 40 plus if you want to have a chance to win a tournament. You want to look at the high upside things. So, and it's the same things we talked about in cash game strategy if you haven't checked that out yet too. But we really want to focus on players that can go the distance and strike out a lot. The player put the complete game shutout and you don't have them, it's going to be hard to win tournaments. So we're going to really look at pitch count, innings pitched. Can they go 7, 8, 9 innings? And do they have a high strikeout potential? I think you're going to worry a little bit less about the win than you would in cash games because if a player puts up a monster performance, the win is relatively going to be worth a little bit less. But obviously, win is going to be indicative of good pitchers in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and looking a little more in detail at the relevant outcomes that happen on DraftKings for pitchers, we can see that wins, innings pitched, hits, and strikeouts are the most prominent metrics that seem to come up on a daily basis. But Sal, how do you look at these outcomes from a tournament perspective when choosing pitchers?
Yeah, so you want to look, as we see, the complete game and shutout chances are very low, generally below 5%. So you're never going to predict them with any certainty. But as we just mentioned, we want to target pitchers that have a potential to do that, because those are the times that are going to really put you over the edge. And the same thing with strikeouts. Can a player strike out 8, 9, 10 players? Can he get hot? So those type of things you really want to look at for pitchers. A little bit different than cash games where you're really more focused about consistency. Can he give me that 20 points every time out? Here you want to look at, can a player put up that 30 points 20% of the time?
Yeah, and then also looking at Vegas data as part of the equation for selecting pitchers. Definitely, as we've said in the cash game strategy, looking at player props and team totals, that can be really important. We haven't touched on the first 5 innings and the importance of that. Sal, you want to talk a little more about that?
Yeah, so first 5 innings is going to be all about the starting pitcher and how the starting pitcher is going to perform, whereas the full game, you're going to get into some of the bullpen data kind of mix in there, so you can kind of really get a much clearer idea of what's going to happen if you look at the first 5 innings lines. So a team like the Yankees with that bullpen now, they're really going to have a lot higher percentage of runs scored in the first 5 innings against them than they would a normal team. So you can kind of get that data out of there by using it the first 5 innings.
Then moving into hitter selection. Now, some of the key elements for hitter selection, specifically for tournaments, we're going to talk a lot about course field, um, being the having the largest run and home run rate of all the ballparks, and tends to have um, higher over unders. It's something that you're definitely going to want to look at early in your research process when looking at hitters, and also batting order, handedness splits, weather conditions. Those things, we're going to look at them a bit differently than we did in cash games. And then home run ability as well. Obviously, more power is going to lead to higher ceiling, possibly more fantasy points. So we're going to touch on all of these things in this section. And then Vegas data, obviously super important. Um, Looking at team expected runs, over under. These things will help indicate the better teams that you could potentially stack with, which we'll get into a little bit later. So first, touching on batting order, and looking at this visual, you can see that the top of the order tends to get more opportunity. But Sal, in thinking differently for tournaments, how do you approach batting order?
Yeah, I think you really got to start looking at power hitters. Looking tournaments, then you're going to get the RBIs, and that's what you'll see is the reason that the third it's going to be higher than the first in terms of average fantasy points per game is because the third hitter is going to have more power, more RBI chances, etc. So you can only score one run at a time, but you can get multiple RBIs at a time. So RBIs are going to be very different, and even on FanDuel, RBIs being worth more than runs and even a single. You really want to kind of target RBI producing spots in order, which can be 3, 4, 5. And then again, this we'll talk about this a little bit more, but the ownership percentages are going to be heavily skewed to the top of the order. Um, so this may be a spot where you want to target some lower in the batting order players who have high power, who can kind of put up a big score in fewer at bats and be lower owned.
Awesome. And then shifting from batting order to handedness splits, and looking at this, obviously, targeting opposing handedness is advantageous for you when building a lineup. But um, just thinking in the prism of ownership, a lot of those players tend to be higher owned. So, how do you view handedness style when looking at tournament hitters?
Yeah, so as we talked about cash games, you really want to focus on that's a different hand for the batter. But here, going to righty might be a way to not lose too much, but also um, gain some lower ownership percentage there. And then too, lefty maybe okay in certain circumstances, especially if it's a bad lefty on the mound that may only go 4 or 5 innings, and it's a top lefty batter, a Bryce Harper or a Cargo, one of my favorites, and they have a lower salary because of the lefty, and you may only get 4 or 5 innings of the starter and 4 innings of the bullpen, then that lower ownership could pay off.
And then moving into weather and ballpark factors, I wanted to focus specifically on course field, and seeing that the run and home run rate is so high here as opposed to other ballparks. Sal, I know you're super passionate about um, always looking into cores first and foremost. What's the situation there, and how that affects the rest of the pricing and other games on the slate when picking hitters. So. Tell us a little more about cores and how you frame that in selecting for tournaments.
Yeah, no, I think when you're looking at tournaments, there's two different strategies when there's course field on the slate and when there's not course field on the slate. Coors Field is obviously going to be the highest owned on most nights, especially a good matchup. And generally for good reason. Same thing in cash games we talked about. But here you really maybe want to take target cores, but in a little different way than you would in cash games. Maybe go lower in the batting order. Maybe not. Maybe do a 3-3 stack. We'll talk more about that in lineup construction. But something you want to think about is how you can still play cores when it makes sense, but do it a little differently than some other people are. Um, and then you really want to also look at what the other higher ownership ballparks are going to be. A lot of people are always going to target Yankee Stadium to um, Rogers Field, the Texas ballpark. So you really want to look at what each ballpark is doing, and if the specific weather on that day is going to give it a little different run scoring than it would on an average day.
Right. And all those situational elements you can find in RotoQL in the Games tab, seeing all the different weather conditions per ballpark. So definitely keep the weather and ballpark conditions in mind. And one other thing we wanted to touch on with ballparks, yeah, Sile, the temperature in relation to average runs per game. What are your takeaways from here?
Yeah, and this is one part of many of the weather factors. You want to target the higher temperature, ball flies farther. Um, More humidity, ball flies farther, which may kind of go against your intuition. And then obviously the wind there too. But here, if you really want to say if I'm a stadium that's not as high scoring, maybe like a Pittsburgh, and the weather's really hot, maybe the average person's not going to catch on to that really warm weather that the ball's going to fly out farther. Or if it's in Arlington in Texas and it's only 70 degrees, then you're really going to get lower runs, but the public may not be aware. I think the ballparks in Chicago, you'll see some of the largest differentiations where it might be 50 one day and 2 days later it might be 80, and you're going to get a lot different results on fly balls. So it's definitely something that's very important that may not be enough to just look at straight ballpark factors, but how they change because of the elements.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's hitter selection. We're going to head now into hot lineup construction, how to bring everything together. And I know that we touched on some of these elements earlier. We're going to go a little more in depth on tournament lineup construction. So, salary distribution, what are the differences between FanDuel and DraftKings, and then the all important ownership and uh, the chalk players, what these are, and how to play them within the construct of tournament lineups. And then obviously stacking and multiple lineups, things that we preach a lot here. We're going to go a little more in depth on how you can do this from a baseball perspective. So first with salary distribution, um, we touched on a little bit in our cash game things, but this is also for tournaments. We can see that the distribution here is often similar, but especially when doing multiple lineups, we definitely want to be aware of how much we're spending on hitters versus pitchers. So, how do you look at salary distribution for tournaments?
Yeah, so I think one thing we talked about the cash game was really targeting good pitchers. We looked at 18K about was what you're spending on pitchers in 50-50s. Here you're looking at a little bit less, and I think that you still want to target good pitchers, but here the important thing is that you need all your players to score if you want to win a GPP. So if you're taking two stud pitchers and you're taking some hitters that are really not going to put up any scores, you're not going to win a GPP even if both your pitchers put up 40 points. So here you're going to do a little bit less money spent on your pitchers, but you still want to target good pitchers. So you still want to spend 17, 18K on average on your pitchers, but you want to make sure that you're not going to have too many zeros in your lineup by taking really poor hitters.
And then moving from salary distribution to now the chalk players, and chalk players being favorite players that are more likely to be high owned, likely to perform well. They tend to be consensus plays. We talked about this in some of our tournament strategy and early RotoQL University videos that definitely want to monitor the chatter on Twitter and articles from a lot of popular DFS sources to kind of figure out what the consensus is looking at for that day. But Sahil, for relation to chalk players, how do you go about choosing them in certain situations, and when do you stay away?
Yeah, so I think to kind of touch on a little bit what you said, like on our QL wire, if you look at all the articles that we have, if you see the same player being recommended in almost all the articles, you can be pretty certain he's going to be a chalk player. And chalk players generally do perform well, but there are certain situations where public may be overestimating him. So really what you want to do is, the way I kind of think about it is, what do you think the chances are? Do you think he's going to be the best play at that position? So if Kershaw is going to be the best play 50% of the time, or let's actually use these numbers, but if I think he's going to be the probability of being the best play at the position 80% of the time, and his projected ownership is 60%, then I'm going to play him. I may go 80 or 100% Kershaw to kind of gain some leverage on his situation. So really, if you're having a player that ownership over the field, you're going to do that in situations where you think his chances of being the best play are higher than his ownership. So if I thought that Kershaw is going to be 40% chance of being the top scoring pitcher, which is still very, very high, but his ownership was 50, 60%, then I'm going to try to fade him a bit. So then what this kind of leads to is you're going to kind of want to play the chalk pitchers a little more often, because they'll be more consistent and have the top pitchers are going to be more likely to be the best plays than I think the best hitters. So if a hitter is going to be 40, 50% owned, but you only think it's going to be the chance of him being the best play is 20%, that's a situation where I may fade him completely. And the last note is it's definitely okay to play a lot of chalk, but you don't want to have chalk all the way through your lineup, especially if you're playing the $3 or $27 tournament, where there's a good chance that lineup may be a duplicate. Your EV is going to drop completely if your lineup's played more than once, and if you get it 4 or 5 times in the $3 tournament, you're going to be losing a lot of money in the long term.
Right, and you can check out articles on the QL Wire. Will give you a good sense of players that are going to be highly owned. But also, looking at the elements that we talked about earlier, when a player has a few of those elements in their favor, being high in the batting order, playing against the opposite hand pitcher, having a high recent production, maybe they're on a hot streak or a hitting streak, all of those things that can factor into a chalk player. And that's why we wanted to also touch on ownership. This is sort of one of the holy grail topics within the DFS industry. How do you go about predicting ownership? As I just talked about, some of the elements that can factor into a high ownership percentage, recent performance, matchup, or even value, fantasy points per salary, which we track all of this in RotoQL, and you can find within our players tab and our insights. but looking at low ownership percentage, and that's what we're ultimately targeting for at least some part of our lineup, so we can be differentiated from the rest of the tournament. Sal, what are the elements that you look for tournament lineups?
Yeah, so I think one thing that you can really take advantage of is on the recent performance. I'm not a big believer in hot streaks, but hot streaks do influence ownership a lot. So I think I'll generally try to target players in good situations, but maybe struggling a lot. They'll have lower ownerships because of that poor recent performance and people's biases and memory. So you can really look at those situations and target those players, and you'll get what will be a good play, but his ownership will be depressed a little bit. And then another thing to look at is maybe overpaying for certain players at lower ownership. So if there's some really good chalk pitchers that are in the 8 or 9K range, or even the 10K range, maybe you go to that the most expensive pitcher of that slate that may be a little bit worse value, but will have a lot lower ownership.
And then looking at stacking, which is obviously a popular strategy for tournaments. You can see that for DraftKings and FanDuel, there are some differences between the two platforms. DraftKings allowing you to stack up to 5 players, FanDuel up to 4 players, and that's going to influence some of the strategy that you can do. DraftKings allowing you to have a 5 player stack and a 3 player stack in one lineup. The most FanDuel allowing you to do is 4 players, and then another 4 player stack. So looking at some of the other stacking strategies, things like mini stacks, value stacks. Sal, what are the things that you like to employ when stacking lineups?
Yeah. So I think it's very important to, and FanDuel, don't overthink it. Always stack 4 players of a certain team. DraftKings, at least do four. 4-4 is viable. 5-3, 5-2-1, 5-1-1, all very good. Um, I think it's important to differentiate yourself. So as you look at core stacks, are always going to be popular. Doing the 1 through 5 is always going to be popular. I really do not recommend stacking 1 through 5 of a popular stack, because you're going to have that same stack um, dozens of times, maybe hundreds of times in your big tournament, and then you're really not going to gain much with your stack. But yeah, once you do that, you got to also be mindful that you're going to have the highest correlation with people that are adjacent in your lineup. So maybe do like a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stack will be a little way to get a little differentiated. And then value stacks of teams that are kind of off everybody's radar can be pretty valuable, even if you're stacking against a good pitcher. If that pitcher blows up, which every pitcher does, you can really take advantage of that and maybe stack the chalk around your value stack.
Yeah, and then also looking at stacking the maximum. Can you talk a little more about that and how you look at that for tournament lineups?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, FanDuel, I always stack 4. Um, DraftKings, I also always stack 5. Um, FanDuel, though, it's way more important. Doing a 4-4 stack or even a 4-3-2, um, that's not going to work, because that's one more than is allowed on DraftKings. So maybe like a 4-3-1 or a 4-2-2 on DraftKings can definitely make sense in certain situations. Um, but FanDuel, just stack the maximum is a takeaway you can take from this. And you also, as we talked about before in lineup construction, you want to make sure that you have enough salary for everybody on your team to be a decent pick. You can't have zeros if you're going to win a tournament. So again, don't stack over half your salary on 5 hitters on DraftKings.
Mm. And looking at stack size on DraftKings, we can see that as you move to 4 or 5 player stacks, the percentage chance of scoring 150 plus points is a little bit higher, albeit not a huge percentage. But just reiterating what Sile said, trying to stack the maximum, the percentages are more in your favor. And looking at tournaments, we here at RotoQL, through Sahil, are huge proponents of putting together multiple lineups, and it's a huge part of Sahil's strategy. And we have created a tool that allows you to do that seamlessly. Sahil, do you want to talk about, from a tournament perspective, why multiple lineups are important? And you can see with this visual, we can talk about what we're seeing here.
Yeah, so basically this visual is looking up based on breaking out by site. What are your chances of a good percentile finish based on the number of lineups that you have? Of course, more lineups are generally going to do better, but you'll see that really once you get past the first 10, 15 lineups, you're really going to see a more consistent increase in your highest percentile finish. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. But what multiple lineups is going to allow you to do is, one is cover, or not cover, but allow you to get exposure to different situations and reduce your variance if you're doing this properly. You got to have a strategy to kind of how you're going to attack things. What percentage teams are you going to stack? What's your ownership going to be for each pitcher? As we talked about before, when we kind of fading to chalk, looking to chalk, that should influence whether or not you go 50% on one player, 100% on one player. But kind of creating 20, 25 lineups will allow you to kind of get multiple exposure to multiple situations, and in the end is really going to allow you to get into those top finishes more frequently.
Yeah, so definitely for those intermediate to advanced players, definitely want to be using multiple tournament lineups, increase your odds of winning. But also check out some of our other videos on RotoQL University to get more sense of tournament strategy. But good luck with those MLB tournament lineups.
Yeah, I think it's also important to note that you have to have a strategy going for multiple tournaments. If you kind of just put in a bunch of lineups hoping to cover all your bases, cover all the angles, you're just going to lose money more quickly. So it's important that, yes, you can have multiple exposures, multiple different situations. You have to do it with a set strategy in mind and how you're going to attack it.